Okay, so ranked number 15 globally on the 2020 Empower Ethnic Minority Future Leaders list, Manpreet Dhillon is an equity, diversity, and inclusion specialist with a unique lens as a leadership coach for women with culturally diverse backgrounds who want to have an equal seat at the table with equal pay. She focuses on creating systemic change to address institutionalized inequalities through representation from the communities being served. Manpreet has over 15 years of leadership, coaching, human resources, and community development expertise. Manpreet is the founder, CEO of VEZA, and an entrepreneur in residence with the Women's Enterprise Center. VEZA has worked with notable organizations, including UN Affiliate, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, UN Women, City of Vancouver, UBC, HR Tech Group, Immigrant Employers Council of BC, Blends Coffee, 7-Eleven, Terramera, as well as a host of tech and biotech companies and nonprofit organizations. She also led a trade mission of women entrepreneurs to Croatia, one of first held by a private company to further the mission of increasing export by women entrepreneurs. Manpreet has held positions as a board member of Canada India Education Society, Live Big Society, BCIT Alumni Board of Directors, past board member of Royal Roads University, and has served on various arts and health boards. Manpreet is a twice contributing author to Chicken Soup for the Soul and a contributing author to Forbes, Thrive Global, and Small Business BC. We will definitely send you a link afterwards to her website so that you can just learn more about what she's up to yourself. She received her master's in organizational management and resides in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Welcome, Manpreet.
Thanks. It's always funny to listen to your bio. Every time I'm like, did we really do those things? Yeah, no, it's always interesting. Well, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. It's always fun to come to an HR community with that lens because, you're coming to not tell people and, not convince people why diversity inclusion is important, but also just going deeper and how to make it happen as well. So it's always fun for me to be here. And awesome. So I know that we're doing some Q&As. How do we want to?
Yeah. So we did post this as an Ask Me Anything kind of a presentation. And so Manpreet, I know you mean that. I know you mean just like no question is bad or dumb or whatever. Like this really is intended to be an opportunity to just let's just talk about how this goes. And I know, Dean, you've come with a few questions. I think you were even like, I'm going to go first because I've got my questions.
Well, I guess to kick things off, and by all means, anybody jump in any time with any questions, either via chat or off mute. But I guess, can you talk to us a little bit about some foundational things about how to set up a framework for diversity within a work environment? How do you measure diversity? And just maybe we'll start there and see what comes of that. I'm sure there'll be more.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we're thinking about setting up the framework for diversity, so it's always an interesting thing so the way that VEZA, we do the work, and Julianne's one of my team members and who's here, I think she's always joke. I'm like, I think sometimes feel like she's stalking me, but I think she just, but she's super supportive. No, it's always amazing to have her on the calls because when we're, as we're talking, she's an HR associate and as well. And as we're thinking about how do we help organizations with the frameworks, it's really thinking about how do they embed equity, diversity, inclusion in the way that the work is done. So obviously I have an HR background, so that's where we kind of start. We do the audits. So when we're thinking about auditing for HR, thinking about the policies, are they inclusive? Is there other opportunities of other underrepresented groups being a part of it as well? But really thinking about the employee life cycle and what are as you're drawing that employee life cycle out, what are ways to be more inclusive throughout the life cycle? When you're starting from, we always talk about the candidate pipeline, how to diversify your pool. Are you looking at outside, other avenues for recruitment and people outside the network? But then when it comes into even the job posting, does it use inclusive language? Is it, gender specific, or is it kind of geared towards a certain type of personality? And then when do you ask the pronouns as well? That's an important piece of inclusivity where people want to be seen and they want to feel that they're, part of the process as well. And then even one of the big things that we always think about is onboarding, because I personally feel that onboarding isn't just, the first little while. It's actually, really a 6-month process, because, as we know that employees make a decision within the first 4 days of how long they're going to stay within the organization. So, but thinking about the onboarding before they even arrive, like who are they being introduced to? How are they being engaged? And how are they going to feel the first day that they show up? Like, how are they going to feel that they belong there and this place was they made the right decision? And it's also connecting them with other team members from other teams as well, not just their team. And then also through the onboarding process, like, when are you having the conversations around careers and what their career path is? And one of the things is, like, we always kind of talk about when we're thinking about, like, you see, these are just some examples of, like, how to kind of move through this whole life cycle process. But one of the things is, like, thinking about from the lens of as you think about immigrant employee, if they're coming from a country where benefits was not one of their primary things, how are we explaining the benefits to them? So I'll give an example where, even through salary negotiations, I was a part of an organization where we hired 2 people. One was, he was from India. He had a postdoc, amazing experience. The other one, same position, was Canadian. Well, he got his PhD out in Europe, and they both got this job at the same time. The person who's Canadian, he's like, oh, I'm obviously going to negotiate. So he ended up negotiating himself a $20,000 increase compared to the Indian man. And also, the Indian man was also offered a lower salary. They're like, well, he's going to want the job, so we can offer him a lower salary. So thinking about this example, it was one of the reasons why I left. I stopped working with the company, because as soon as I brought that to attention, nothing was done about it. And I chose to leave, because I was like, that's not alignment for me. But those kind of things, like, if we're having some people who are coming in who are so excited to get the job that they need the job, or they're really looking for it, they might not negotiate. And then that's where even pay inequities start happening. And so how do we, as HR professionals, what's our role in not, telling them to negotiate, but how do we encourage them to know that there's an open window, and give them a hint that they know to negotiate a little bit, or what that might look like. And so, again, thinking about frameworks, like, these are the kind of things that we kind of look at when we're looking at the frameworks, like, look at the employee life cycle, look at inclusivity, and what the options might be from there. And then when we're thinking about measuring, that's always an interesting one. So I'm just going to do a shameless plug. We have an assessment tool that we use for measurement of how well the organization is doing. I think it's really important to both have, like, the organizational assessment on how much have they embedded equity, diversity, inclusion in the way they operate, and then also having the employee lens of, what's the employee's experience like. So that's where the employee surveys are so important. And so that's, one measurement. Then we also look at retention, we look at promotion rates, looking at, when we're looking at recruitment pools as well, like, how diversified are the recruitment pools. We also look at productivity. Like, if we have different teams, we've had some clients who have measured, they've had a diversity of thought team, and then one that wasn't. They actually measured what the revenue differences were for both teams. And they actually started to notice massive differences. And so for them, that was an internal thing that they did. And it was really amazing to see the data that they put forward as well.
Interesting. Lisa, I think you mentioned you have a question. Do you want to ask Manpreet?
Yeah, I do. Because I actually was just having this conversation with a colleague last week, and we were talking about diversity and inclusion. And I said, it may not be popular, but I'm not really fond of labels. And when the trends come into HR, we're going to focus on employee engagement, and then it's diversity and inclusion, because I think that we always need to be considering these things. So I just have a fundamental thing against sort of labels or fads or trends. And we started talking about what does that look like, and we kind of just landed on it's respect of all people, respect of, everybody's situation. And why can't we focus on just respect versus labeling diversity and inclusion, and maybe that helps to educate other people. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, and if I'm missing something from that lens.
I think I might be missing something too, because I focus on the same thing. So one of the reasons, so I'm totally on board with that, because I believe that if we treat people as humans, we focus on their strengths and we focus on what they're bringing to the organization, and hiring the right people. But we have to have the systems and processes in place in order to do that. All of the trends in the diversity inclusion will just happen. So for me, I'm using the language of diversity inclusion because I've been doing this work for 15 years, and for me, it was like, how do we get people engaged in the conversation of thinking outside the box and thinking that they might need to recruit differently, or they might need to have different mechanisms in place within their workplace for everyone to succeed, like for more people to succeed. And so I do agree with that, the principle of like, let's treat people as humans and strong. That's why we actually, the way that we do the work, like the way that we're doing the work is like really looking at how do we embed it within, and just the way that the workflow is done, internal communications is strong. How do we educate and make people aware of what's available to them and those kind of things. And if things are done right, you're going to be inclusive. But I also do believe that there's still too many people who forget that neurodiversity can be amazing for certain roles. There's other people that forget that immigrant women could be the right candidate, even if their English isn't right or their written isn't right. There's roles available for them that they wouldn't go through the normal systems if we set those up like in the way that we set them up. All those candidates would be filtered out. We know that there's so many systems that when we're going through interview processes, if it's, we know that a lot of these candidates from underrepresented groups, they don't do as good as behavioral interviews because they don't know they aren't fully, the confidence might not be there, the way that they communicate might not be there. So we need to think about how do we even move through the AI systems and move through the screening process so their resumes aren't filtered out constantly because they have a bad resume. So I totally agree with you. And that's actually, I just hope that people would be educated enough that that's what we do. But we do need to be considerate of there's other challenges there that people have that we sometimes miss. And we need to be aware of those in order to give more equitable opportunities as well. Does that help to answer your question, Lisa?
That was fantastic. Thank you. And I'm totally in agreement with all those thoughts. So thank you.
Feel free to jump in, anybody, if you have questions or send via chat.
I have a question. Hi, it's Georgina here. So our company, we've just started diving into this. Obviously, earlier this year, it was a hot topic, and I didn't want it to be something that came and went. So as a leadership team, this is a topic we're talking about. We've done some of the low-hanging fruit of we've reviewed all of our job postings. We've updated everything so the languaging is more inclusive as well in our policies and communications. What are some suggestions for things we can do from an employee level? So it's not something that's coming like HR is pushing or the leadership team is pushing on people, but what are some of the things that can come more like grassroots or kind of have suggestions or things we can plant seeds to have grow across our organization from an employee level and not just a policy, procedure, structural level?
Yeah, that's actually the largest question, like the most often question I get is what people are like, what can I do as an individual? So one of the things that we, for employees, it's like actually like when they kind of, who are they, like even kind of getting them prompts, like, who are you going to go out and meet for lunch? Like, who are you meeting for, not lunch, sorry, I keep forgetting we're all remote. Who are you going to go and, who are you talking to that might not be a part of your regular circle? And when we kind of give a tip sheet to like employees, think about when you're in meetings, did everyone speak? Does someone need a champion in the meeting? And when is the last time, like, were they cut out or whatever that might be? And for employees to also kind of plan some of the social activities or plan some of those different types of, activities. Because even when we have trivia, there's some people who might not be able to participate in trivia. So thinking about what are some more inclusive activities we can do even though we're remote? What would that be? And giving employees the opportunities to do that as well. When employees are part of like, you know, can they be like mentoring within the organization or outside the organization? How can they support how can they champion someone else? And what would that look like? Who can they be a buddy towards? That is like new, you know, who's been there for a while, new to the organization, or somehow just need some extra support, who can they be a buddy towards, and that really helps as well. So those are some of the like the key things that we talked about with employees. And then also some of the employee initiatives, like I mean, a lot of the committees that we have, they actually start their own employee resource groups. And that for them gives them the voice, or having like the BIPOC listening group. And some of the employees like getting together to do that, and where they're kind of no really action, but they're also like, that's actually changing the culture. And so that's been really, a lot of the organizations we're working with, like that's been really helpful, like those listening groups. And might not just be BIPOC. And then they ended up having a couple of the organizations, they had BIPOC, then they, you know, went to LGBTQ2S+, and then went to Indigenous. So they ended up having different ones. And people from other groups were going to them to listen because they're like, we want to know. But some of them, one organization, they don't invite others because they just want to keep it within those groups. But that's been amazing to watch, and how the movement shifted. And then, you know, some of the committees some of the organizations, we had like the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee, and these individuals have gone and like, they're scrutinizing, they're looking at the strengths, and they're actually working with each of their departments to be like, how can we be more inclusive? Because they just feel so empowered to do something. And even though they don't have any decision-making role, they're just being accountable. They're holding everyone else accountable for the organization to be at a higher standard. So it's been really amazing to watch, and at the employee level to really shift the culture from a foundational level as well.
Thank you.
One of the things that you mentioned when we were chatting a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this that really struck me, Manpreet, was, you know, asking yourself the question, whose voices are we missing? And so I guess my question is how do you identify that in itself? And is there such a thing as having too many voices to move some of these initiatives along?
I do agree that sometimes there is too many voices, because it's death by too many committee members, you know, or whatever that might be. So I think it's important that when we're thinking about this, is thinking about, so when you're sitting around, you know, you're about to make a decision, and even kind of thinking about, did we consider the voices of our community that we're serving with this, whatever decision we're making? And if so, did we, if we didn't, who represents that voice within this community, and how did they find out what those people needed, right? And so did we give them an avenue to have that voice? So sometimes, you know, it doesn't, for me, it's always important that whoever's at the table is being considerate of who they're representing, how did they listen to them, and how often are they actually getting their feedback and insights to influence the decisions as well, and making sure that the credit comes that way. And so when at a time that there's certain times that you do need to have certain people at the table, because it is a part of the decision-making process. Because when you don't, no matter how much what filters is that advice, insights, and whatever else coming through, when it's getting filtered out, and maybe that's when we're missing it as well. So it's a hard process to be like, you know, here's a checklist and this is what we do. But it's also just first reflecting back on who's the community we're serving, and are we being representative of that community? And is there another possibility of looking at this differently that we might be missing? And even asking yourselves that question in a meeting. And I've seen that question being asked in multiple meetings, and people are saying like, oh, wait a second, we haven't even considered this perspective. Sure. But that becomes a part of the agenda. Like these questions actually become a part of the agenda, and making that happen that way.
We did have a question come in privately. So Manpreet touched on language and job descriptions and postings. So do you have any recommendations for best practices to start improving and attracting a more diverse talent pool?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about languages, a lot of the old languages were written so I'll give you two examples. So old languages were written with a very masculine lens and masculine like leadership lens. So when I talk about masculine, it's not gendered. It's really about the looking at the masculine, feminine, like from the energy perspective. So feminine leadership principles around empathy, collaboration, strategy, thinking about connection, people, those kind of things. When we think of masculine, it's more the thinking about the action orientated, what's the final goal, what the targets are, those kind of things. When we have job descriptions that are balanced, you actually will appeal to different people and having a balance of the languages. And then also when we're thinking about languages, this is, so we were doing an audit for a company, and their job descriptions were written really well, really fun, but they were like, why do we keep attracting really young people who are Canadian descent? I was like, well, they're written for that when you look at the language and the way the tone is, and they obviously it's hard to listen to that, so they took offense to it because they're like, well, no, like, but our job pool has been different and all these things, and I'm like, yeah, but you also just said that your job, like most of the candidates that you end up hiring are from a different thing, and candidate pool might be different. But if you look at the job description from a different lens, if you come from a culture where, you're a little bit more serious, or you have hierarchies, treated a little bit differently, or you're coming from a culture where it's just work is like work, it's not about play necessarily, your job descriptions aren't written to relate to those individuals as well. So it's really thinking about when you're thinking about the employee persona that you're trying to attract, and like what are the values of the individual that you're trying to attract and within the organization, without the labels, because I actually don't like labels as well. But thinking about what are the values, what are the traits, and what are the, thinking about what kind of transferable skills can they bring together. Write the job description with that person in mind. So marketing has always done it right. They always have their customer persona that they write to. HR needs to write to their employee persona. And that's when we do that persona piece, we can actually write to a broader audience as well and still have like culture ads coming in.
Another question from the floor here. What learning resources or tools would you suggest to help train leadership on cultural differences? Many leadership I've worked with just haven't had the opportunity to meet others from different cultures than their own, and they simply don't know what they don't know about their own biases, for example, or how a particular culture may tend to have a certain approach to developing relationships or communication style, etc. So their intention is to hire and encourage more diversity. They don't know where to learn more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. That's such an important question because so one of the, I always like go back to this example. This woman, she came to one of my diversity sessions and she's like, I lived in Vancouver. I've met people who are Asian, but I've never had to have interactions with them because there's never been an opportunity to. And how do I learn about them when there's no way to interact and I don't want to be ignorant to ask. So there's one book I love. It's called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. It's like one of my favorite books because it really explains the cultural communication differences. And then also one of my biggest things is like, this is not what, it's not a book and a resource. Think about the culture festivals that happen around the city. Like Vancouver, where we do have a lot of culture festivals. Get people to attend those. And those culture festivals exist to educate people about their cultures. That's a great place to go and ask questions at. And even contacting, you can just contact the cultural association. Usually the people who are volunteering their time or a part of that organization, they're so happy to share about their culture. And it's actually the best place to learn. Like, honestly, I've because it's also fun because you also get to engage with like, with the traditions and the culture and like through food, music, and experiences. But then also you can go and ask questions and people are so happy to answer them at those places because that's why they actually host them.
And a follow-up to that, how do we learn, and again, this is from the floor, how do we learn about what are the values of each culture? You mentioned hierarchies, tone of speech. Where can we learn more about how to approach others and learn?
So I'm going to have like a non-popular opinion on this, but so my viewpoint is everyone is different. Treat people as individuals. It goes back to the question of treating people as humans. If people look at me and they think I'm South Asian, I don't act the South Asian way. I grew up in Canada. My values are more Canadian than they are Indian. If someone tries to treat me South Asian, I actually will be offended. So, and I'm like, I'm not the only person, and like, and when we start to think about, just because we think someone's from a certain culture, that's what we should understand. Why not just ask them and what they need? And when we just ask people, become curious, we actually will get more information, and that's when inclusivity really happens. I'm like constantly over the last couple of months, people are just like, oh, but we want to, if they're thinking about their strategies for marketing strategies for different cultural groups and stuff. And I was like, yeah, you can use those because there's certain things that like connect into that. Like, but it's when you're doing a Diwali campaign, we're going to see all these organizations do Diwali campaigns. It's great because that speaks to the certain immigrant population who wants to see aspects of themselves within it. But then the first generation, second generation are just like, oh, that's just a typical thing that they're doing. That's really offensive. Not offensive, but it's like, oh, they're just doing it because it's a marketing ploy. So when we start to bucket people, we're like creating separation again. So how about we focus on just being curious and just looking at what does each person, like kind of going back to the human experience of what does that human person need that's going through the part of our organization, and how do they work? And actually asking them, like, it was one of the biggest things, like one of my employees a long time ago was Chinese. And me and her, every time she would come to meetings and she was just like, yeah, but then she wouldn't go do what I asked her to do. And finally I was like, look, we keep having this issue of like, things don't get done. I think we're on the same page, but things, and she's like, well, you're too young for me to be my manager. And then also the fact that I can't say no to you because you're my manager. And she was, because I grew up in Chinese culture. And I was like, oh, interesting. And then I tried to treat I had another like, staff member who was Chinese. And I was like, oh, trying to be conscious about that. And she was kind of like, I don't care about hierarchy because I was from a different generation of Chinese and we don't care about that. I was like, that is true. So I learned it the hard way. So I'm always trying to tell people, don't learn the hard way, just be curious and ask. So
that's an awesome statement. Just be curious and ask. So another private question that's come in. So I'm a leadership and business coach. What's important for me to know, learn, and dive into more around equity and inclusion so I can serve my people clients better? I want to learn, but I'm a bit overwhelmed with where to start.
Oh yeah, there's so much overwhelm. Absolutely. I think that one of the biggest things that when we're from a leadership coach perspective, again, it goes back to, I think that there's a lot of education out there. Obviously, like I've just been watching. And so I focused on one group and I've been focusing on, that's where my education comes from. And I'm like, okay, in this month, I'm going to focus on my education of Black history. And then what does that look like and how does that translate into, the work that I do? One of the things is, it's such a, I'm just trying to think of like, what's the easiest way? Cause there is so much, it's overwhelming. And I actually had to just take a pause from all the learning. Cause I was like, I can't do this anymore. I think the biggest thing is, I always go back to be curious about the person and what's going to influence them. Just be aware of the fact that there might be other things that are challenging them right now. And how do we, and as a coach, like it's just diving into what are some other influences that might be influencing them other than what we see, like the culture influences. We know that even when we think about intergenerational even trauma, and I usually don't talk about this in certain meetings, but we're going to go there now. So when we think about intergenerational trauma and how that shows up for individuals, if someone's coming from a background where, their ancestors were in war, they had famine, or there was like poverty, there's going to be some triggers of these emotional reactions that are happening right now without even them being aware that it's coming from past generations. Mm-hmm. And so I think even just having I'm more focused on how do we look at internal family systems and how do they influence people and how they influence people, leaders, and who they are. Because when we're thinking about internal family systems, not only does it help them from their personal side, but it also helps them understand on what their team members might be going through. So my education lately, like, because I was like learning about Black history, then I was learning about Indigenous, and and this is a book that I actually I've been reading into as well, called Indigenous Relations. It's been really great. And it just started to, it was like too much, because I'm like, I can't tangibly do something with this right now. And then when I was like started diving into the internal family systems, I'm like, okay, we need to go back to people's psychology, like, and it's going back to like, how do we motivate, engage individuals, especially when there's so much trauma being activated, there's collective grief happening, and how do we work through that, and actually doing the education piece in that space, because everyone, again, is experiencing so many emotions right now. If we can actually help people manage those emotions, that's actually the biggest contribution we can make.
Amazing. So Love HR has raised their hand.
Hi,
Is it you,
yeah,
Shani?
it is. Yeah, it's just me.
Hi.
I'm in my home here today, so I had myself on mute up until now. But I appreciate the chance to ask a question. And first of all, just to say thank you for doing this. And Manpreet, really appreciate what you've said thus far. I guess my question, it starts off with a bit of a comment, is that increasingly, and actually I'd love to calibrate that with you as well. But what I've been seeing lately, and I hear you say, be curious, which I love, because to me, that is how we, can get into understanding and respecting people based on what they want. And it's actually been the biggest difference, I think, in my HR career, where in the beginning, it was all, one size fits all, build a system, put everybody through the hopper, they have to fit in or they fall out. Whereas now HR is much more, meeting people where they're at, finding ways to have a system that flexes and accommodates and meets people. So that's been an exciting journey. But what I'm finding more and more, and I hate to sound like generational, because I realize I'm 30 years now in the business and I'm getting old. I'm sounding like one of those old grannies about it, but is that a lot of the people, especially younger people that I interact with, almost become offended when you ask a question. It's like if you ask somebody, what do you do for Christmas dinner, or do you celebrate Christmas, that somehow you're being offensive to them or being racist because you're judging that they might be different. And maybe I'm asking the questions wrong, I'll own that, but I'm trying to wrap my head around how do you, obviously there has to be trust first, but it does seem like just asking is a real prickly issue. Whereas, God love them kind of thing, the older generation would ask terrible questions extremely bluntly, but at least they wanted to know. Now I find you have to tread so carefully on the question that sometimes it's so much effort to think about a question and that you just don't go there because people are really prickly about it. And I realize there's a lot of dynamic around just COVID right now, but I don't think this is just COVID. I know I started noticing this years and years ago, as we were training young people in particular. And I'm curious, have you seen any of that? Am I, out to lunch on this? And if I am, please tell me how I can ask questions better. And if you have seen it, I'd love a little bit of guidance on what you think can be done to resolve this issue.
Yeah, no, I see that all the time. So it's always like, I'm from, I'm a little bit older. So my generation, we still ask questions, right? It was a part of like just how we do things. And so it's been really interesting because I was talking to some of my younger friends and colleagues. I like to have like some of my friends they're more vibrant when they're younger. So it's really fun to
Totally.
talk with them here and there. But, I was asking them, I'm like, well, why do you get so, like, we're seeing this whole thing about these question things and what is the issue? Like, and what can we do differently? And they're like, well, we don't want to be seen differently. But then I'm like, but you also want to be unique. So I don't know, how to support you unique. So I'm not going to have the best answer for you because I haven't really resolved it. But I think one of the things that I kind of, the way that I've been, we kind of guide on approaching it is, it is like the level of trust. Also just kind of leaving the question open, being like, we're thinking about doing things differently within the organization on how do we look at parties. What's your feedback into that? They'd love to get feedback and they'd love to be anonymous with it most of the time. or they'd love to have the opportunity to provide insight. And so that kind of question, like, how can we do this differently? You know, we're trying to see if we need to do things differently here. What are some of the things we can do differently? So that kind of works. You know, they're a generation where the polls, the surveys, like when you're kind of using engagement in a different way, and the tools and engagement tools in a different way, that really helps. And it's, and I also, like, I go back to the cultural things. Like I think that's where I found my safe ground, is when I actually I'll contact the cultural associations and be like, look, we're trying to figure out, you know, how do this group celebrates like these type of holidays, like, can you explain it to us? And that's been my fail-safe for quite a number of years, actually, for the last 15 years. Because I was like, it's my safe space, there's a trust there, and also they want to answer the question too. So it's not, sorry, I can't answer it any other way, but that's just how I've been dealing with it.
Honestly, that's the thing I miss the most about Vancouver, because I lived there for many, many years, is the culture festivals where you could go and ask, and they would like pull you aside and bend your ear all day.
Yeah.
But, and I do find, you know, here, honestly, you know, I'm trying to approach this with good intent, to ask questions individually, and finding that like dangerous ground sometimes. So yeah, I'll go back to my culture festivals. Thank you for the suggestion. And also, actually, thank you for the reminder on the engagement surveys and some of that. I tend to be quite direct. Like, I want to just hear from the individual. And to your point, I'm approaching that in a very, I guess, old school way. So thank you. That's great.
Thanks for the question, Shawnee. We have one more question privately. I'm interested in neurodiversity and inclusion. Everything you said applies, but do you have any other thoughts or recommendations around neurodiversity that might be different than looking at cultural diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, completely. So neurodiversity, I mean, the one thing I always like, I love these stories when I hear about, you know, there's these two examples. There's this one company in India. So what they've done is really, for all of their, I think it was like a customer service position, they hired not customer service. So it was a cleaning position of some sort. They hired people on the spectrum, and like, people have commented on, first of all, these people are nice to them. They're totally engaged, and the place, like the hotels, have looked amazing because they were just focused on the task and what that looked like. But one of the things is they also realized that they couldn't have that much people interaction, so they would partner up with certain, you know, depending on where they were on the spectrum, they would partner them up with someone else, so that if a customer was, you know, kind of approaching them, the other person would kind of handle the conversation. And then when we're thinking about neurodiversity, like, so I'm not a professional, like that's not our expertise. Focus professionals, they do some amazing work on neurodiversity, and I know that they published some great reports on it as well. And the diversity hub, we actually have some neurodiversity resources. So through the HR Tech group, Veza worked on this. We created this hub of best practices, well, not all best practices, but checklists and resources for diversity and inclusion. There's over 300 plus resources on there, and there's quite a bit on neurodiversity in there. A lot of it's from focused professionals. But when we're also just remembering, when we have people with a neurodiversity perspective, that they're really good at certain things, and is remembering that their interactions are going to be different, their interviews are going to be different. So we need to be conscious about the fact, you know, some of the things that we measure within interviews, they're not going to be able to do well with the, you know, the eye contact or keeping the conversation engaged. They might not trust you the same way. And the interview is going to be just feel differently when we're doing the interview. So being conscious of that when you're going through the interview process as well. And also, even when their job applications sometimes might come in, this is generalization, are pretty brief, because they're just like, well, that's just how they approach certain things, because they're just like, again, laser focus on like, this is what needs to be done, but get it done. But I would go to focus professionals or go to the hub to get the resources as well.
Lisa has raised her hand.
Yeah, I wanted to build a little bit off Shawnee's comments, because I actually had posted a question as well that was very similar. But I think as we're trying to be more and more curious and be very respectful, I usually come out and just in a sensitive way ask questions or just to try to learn more. But we worry so much about offending people, and I'm curious to know how including teaching about, respecting each person as human beings, how do we start also teaching people how to be less offended? Because we've really shifted the pendulum, and we're at that point that we can't have really healthy dialogue, debate, because somebody's going to be offended. So it's creating a lot of silence, I think, in our workplaces right now.
Yeah, so I think it's going back to the safe spaces again. Like, what does safe space look like? We were, because people do get offended, and as I just had an example yesterday, we were going to a client, like we're doing an equity, diversity, inclusion like committee, and we've created a safe space, and we're like, you can say whatever you want, and people can bring their voices forward. And someone said something, the other person cut them off. The person rolled their eyes because they have like this whole other dynamic there. And then the other person, they called and they're like, that wasn't a safe space. Like, we're supposed to be holding these safe spaces to be able to say what you want. And it was really interesting because you can feel the stress is high, but you can also, and I was like, well, we actually put this going back to charters again, and what does that look like? And, like you can use obviously in committees, but even going back to like having the space, having the conversation that this isn't meant to be offensive. This is meant to be for me to be curious. And this is meant for me to understand you better so I can be of service to you better. And when people I think understanding intentions again goes back, it helps to create that safe space. And I've been going back to charters. And we've actually been promoting charters again, because I'm like, if people have the conversation what that space looks like for them, or what the team function needs to look like for them, or how the organization functions, and actually have like a flat out conversation about, hey, we're going to ask you questions sometimes because we want to know, and how we want to know you better, and we want to know how we can serve you better. It kind of eliminates the silences that are happening, because I'm the same boat. I think people are just personal story, like over the last couple of months, when people are just like, oh, go educate yourself. I think that was so hard, because you can go educate yourself, but people are like, I don't know where to start, I don't know what to do, and it was overwhelming. And then there's this like whole analysis paralysis, and then but white people weren't allowed to say anything because they're supposed to go educate themselves, but they want to ask people questions, but then no one wants to answer the questions, and then it kind of created more separation than not. And for me, it was really frustrating to watch that, because coming from arts and culture, we come from spaces where people want to educate, people want to engage, want to have those conversations. And watching it, I'm like, I understand the emotional labor, but how much that word has become such a, there's so much heaviness around it now. And it's so much a part of conversation where, 8 months ago, not 10 months ago, that was not that much of a conversation. And so I think it goes back to understanding that, trying to gauge where, and asking people like, look, I'm going to ask you a question about that might feel, it's a little bit more about personal. Are you open to answering it? And giving them the option before asking the question. And then that also kind of makes them aware that they might be coming across a little bit closed off as well.
Another question from the floor. Some individuals are now adding pronouns in their organizations, etc. How do we support different generations to understand this shift or be comfortable with it? Some generations or individuals may feel uncomfortable based on their values, beliefs, etc. How do we respect and incorporate all perspectives?
Oh, completely. So one of the things lately we've been just recommending, educate on why pronouns are important. I've had so many multiple conversations on what do the pronouns even mean? Like, I think this week I've had like at least 4 people ask me, like, we don't actually know what the pronouns mean, or why people are doing this, and educating on why that is. And then also making a suggestion rather than a policy, so that people do feel more comfortable. And that's part of inclusivity as well. So people have the choice of what they want to do. and also know that they can't, and then just being like, if you're not using your pronouns, then don't be offended if someone doesn't address you with the right pronoun either.
Great. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit, Manpreet, about some of the things that are or aren't happening that you think should be at the grassroots level, elementary schools, high schools, resources for parents, things of that nature?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the, the schools are so difficult right now with all of the kids. But it's interesting because a lot of these kids were home obviously for the last so many months. So when all of the George Floyd murder happened and everything else, that the Black Lives Matter movement happened, if parents weren't educating them, the kids didn't have a understanding on how the world is changing all around them and how they were a part of this change. But if the parents didn't educate them, that it's not going to happen. So, and I watch, because I have like nieces and nephews who the parents didn't address the issues with them, and these kids have no concept still of like what just happened in the world and how the world just shifted. And because usually the parents are like, well, we're so used to them getting the education at school, we didn't know how to approach the conversation. And so I think it goes back to like, even so with the kids, they're getting a certain type of education at school, but when you're, through their home, are they, looking at what kind of diverse books are they reading? Are they engaging with people, individuals and other kids? Well, how much engagement can happen that are from different backgrounds as well? And how can, as parents, you can facilitate that? Sitting down and having conversations with some of the big topics that are going on and trying to explain it to them at their level of some of what's happening in the world and why that's important. With the school systems, there's a huge opportunity to be more inclusive, huge opportunity to look at what inclusivity within education system needs to look like. We see that some teachers are doing some great work with it, but we need to have that at part of the curriculum. And I think that with the push of getting Black history included in there, but Indigenous, even talking about incidents like the Kamagata Maru, when instead of just being one small paragraph and actually doing a unit on that, those are the things that make a difference when people understand that we had internment camps in Canada, we've had so much genocide in Canada as well, and what that looks like, and that kind of education and helping your child process that when they come home. And I think that's the most important piece. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine and she's like, yeah, my child, he comes home and he's like, I just learned all this about the Indigenous stuff. And he's like, I feel heavy and I don't know how to deal with my emotions now. And it's too much for me. And he had the language to say that, but he was like, I'm going to go and sleep because I feel too much emotion. And that's where I think the parents of teaching emotional intelligence is one of the biggest things that we can do, and teaching the resiliency.
I have another private question here. How does an organization maintain inclusivity and diversity when there are people who abuse the system? For example, pulling the race card or the culture card, basically using inclusion and diversity as a clutch for poor behavior, performance, or work attitude.
I think we go back to understanding what the difference between bias and discrimination is, and what is about what that looks like. And if there's enough evidence, so I think it's important to educate people on the differences of that. And when it is race card, I just laughed because I was like, how many times I remember growing up and people are like, oh, they're just racist. I'm like, no, they're not. They're just, you were being obnoxious, and that's why they don't want you in the store. And so and those were my cousins, so I can say that. It's not cheek because I was like, no, it's not a race thing. But I think it's an important piece to go back to the education piece and what the different differences are. What if it's really really isn't a safe environment for them, that's a deeper question on what does safety mean to them and what would that look like for them. And I think that when people are abusing the system, it's going to understand on what is that mechanism, like even talking to their team members or their managers about like what does sensitive, like what I don't like promoting training all the time, but having discussions around why this is being a part of the conversation and kind of diving into it from that sense. And I think it's still an important piece to focus on inclusivity, but also to understand that these conversations are going to come up, but finding out what's underlying, because a lot of the times what we're finding is when they're saying, oh, it's a race card, but it's because they don't feel like they have an equal opportunity, or they feel like they weren't given the promotion that they deserved, or they don't have pay equity in some way. And there's some kind of like underlying issue that they're trying to deal with, that actually they're using the race card as an example for.
I've also seen it, I mean, as many of us probably have stories, but just with like mental illness.
Yeah.
Well, I have depression and you're not performing. So
Yeah.
so let's figure out, you know, how to get you the supports you need. But I think, like, yeah, to your point, like teasing apart just what's being presented is so important, so that we can address all of it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Any other questions? We have some people starting to hop off here. And the final question, I think I have, Dean and I were chatting about this just before you came on. Just, I mean, I think there's so many of us who want to be part of the solution, and but also are a little nervous, like about, you know, because I worry that because I'm white, that that there may not, that there may be, you know, even criticisms for me stepping out and wanting to be part of the solution. And so, you know, I don't think I'm alone in just kind of going, okay, I want to step forward, use my voice, like use my influence where I have it or whatever. But I don't want to be seen as someone who's trying to hop on a bandwagon, or who's trying to, like, you know, somehow step into a place where it could be perceived that I have no right. So how do you help?
So I have a deep issue with this, because I get so annoyed all the time when people, sorry, this is not like, I get so annoyed when people are like, oh, that person's white, they don't deserve to be here, or they don't have any right to be here, they don't have the lived experience. I mean, the only reason I even got that award for Empower 50, like the whatever award list, was because I stood up for one of my white friends who's doing amazing diversity inclusion work in the city. And someone was like, oh, well, she's white, well, how is she doing this, you know, and why is she doing it? And I'm like, she deserves to do it, because there's certain people that are going to listen to her, and there's other people that are going to listen to me. And it sucks for me that people will have me a part of like panels and stuff because of the color of my skin, right? And that's not fair either. And it really is actually been really disheartening for me, because half the time I'm like, oh, it's not on merit, it's based on the fact I'm a color of my skin. And it, you know, after I've worked so hard. And then, so I am a firm believer that be authentic to who you are, be authentic about being a part of the solution. Even there's going to be the naysayers, but you just have to, if you're truly passionate about it and you're truly authentic about it, just do the work. And just make sure that you are using your privilege to open doors for other people. That's the biggest thing. And you know, it's this happened to me this morning. Like, so last night there's a panel, there's 3 of us who were being asked. 2 people are like, look, we've been on a lot of panels, we think Manpreet needs to raise her voice because she has a racialized view. And again, for the color of my skin, I was being put on this panel. But they're also like, they're like, we have so many opportunities, we think we need to give Manpreet this opportunity, because it's a wider panel, and with influence. But that's where you use your privilege to do that, right? But be authentic to what you're doing, and being authentic to, and being, you know, and just I think it's so important but doing it from a genuine place. And people will say it, but that's okay. And but do the work, because we need everyone engaged. We need everyone. Like, I hope that in 10 years we're not even having this conversation, which is not going to be the case. Right. But if we don't have, it's the same thing about the gender conversation. If we don't have the men involved, the conversation is not going to change. How can people of color just think that, BIPOC people think that we're going to change the world if we don't have the white population a part of that solution? So it doesn't work that way. So So sorry, I get really passionate about this topic. I'm like, because I'm just like, it blows my mind and how much separation we have in this world, and we're actually promoting that even more. So
I feel like this is a super good spot to wrap up on. Dean, any closing comments from you?
No, just thanks so much, Manpreet, for your expertise and your guidance on this very important topic. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. It was a great conversation today, and really appreciate everybody's perspectives and thoughts.
Yeah. No,
Yeah. So in the chat, the chat's lighting up here, and yeah, just do the work is ringing through your mind, Shawnee. Same, like just do the work, be authentic, be curious.
Yeah.
Manpreet, I am grateful, and grateful to you, Dean, for doing this with me, and everybody for coming. Hopefully we'll see you next month. Next month we have Stuart Babineau, who is, he's done a lot of things, but he's a lead in bullying and harassment for WorkSafe BC. And we're going to put him on the spot in particular around how do we navigate bullying and harassment when we're looking at remote and hybrid teams. Many of us, you know, sort of had some stuff at least figured out from our processes and policies and so on when we're co-located, but what does this look like when, where are the risks, where are the opportunities, what does this change for our processes? And he's super passionate about this. So, so really, really excited to have him come. Thanks so much, everybody. Have an awesome day.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was awesome.